Hello, and welcome to Tales from South Florida, the podcast where we explore the people, places, and events that help shape the South Florida we know today. I'm your host, Bill Monty, and I'm inviting you to once again take a talk down memory lane with me. Now, since this episode is being released around Independence Day 2026, I thought we'd do something a little bit different. Every 4th of July, we celebrate fireworks, parades, backyard barbecues, and the birth of our nation. We hear stories about Philadelphia, Boston, the Founding Fathers, the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. But have you ever wondered what was happening in South Florida on that historic day? Were people in Miami celebrating? Probably not. There was no Miami. There weren't any fireworks lighting up Biscayne Bay. Did anyone even gather together to read the Declaration? The answer might surprise you. Let's get started.
These are the tales from South Florida for you, with your host, Bill Monty.
The reality is that while history was being written in Philadelphia, South Florida was so isolated, so sparsely populated, and so disconnected from the 13 colonies, it's very possible no one here even knew the Declaration of Independence existed. Today, we're traveling back nearly 250 years to discover what South Florida actually looked like when America was born. When people think about colonial America, they usually imagine the original 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. That's pretty normal, right? Well, Florida was not one of those. In fact, Florida belonged to Great Britain, but it was not part of the rebellion. Following Britain's victory in the French and Indian War, Spain turned Florida over to Britain in 1763. The British divided the territory into two colonies, East Florida and West Florida, kind of like the same way it is today. North Florida, South Florida. Present-day Miami sat within British East Florida. So while colonists to the north were preparing to separate from England, the people living in Florida remained British subjects. That alone makes Florida's history unique. See, the American Revolution wasn't simply a war that was happening somewhere nearby. It was a conflict that was taking place in another part of British North America, basically taking part in a whole other world. You know, one of the most fascinating things historians have discovered is just how few people actually lived in Southeast Florida in 1776. Today, it's difficult to imagine because there are millions of people that call this area home. But in 1776, this region was untouched wilderness. Countless mosquitoes, wildlife everywhere. If you stood on the shore of Biscayne Bay on July 4th, 1776, you probably wouldn't have seen another human being all day. Lots of alligators, though. Yes, that I'm sure of. So what happened to the native people living in Florida at that time? Long before Europeans arrived, South Florida was home to thriving indigenous communities. Groups like the Tequesta had lived here for centuries. But by the late 1700s, those numbers had dramatically declined. European diseases devastated native populations. And while some survivors relocated to Cuba, others became caught in the growing system of colonial slavery. Entire communities just vanished. By the time the Declaration of Independence was signed, the indigenous population that had once flourished around Biscayne Bay had largely vanished. And that has got to be one of the saddest chapters in our history. And it's easy to overlook because, really, so few physical reminders remain. So who lived here? Well, there are probably quite a few people. Historians believe a small number of Bahamian farming families may have settled along parts of the coast on isolated homesteads, certainly not in cities or towns. Families trying to survive by farming, by fishing, by living off the land. Imagine being separated from the nearest settlement by miles of wilderness. Communication was incredibly slow. News traveled only as fast as a sailing ship or someone riding horseback. And South Florida, way down here, not exactly on the main route. Although England officially controlled Florida, they invested very little in the Southeast Florida area. There weren't any major forts in the area that would become Miami. There were no significant towns. Instead, British officials spent much of their effort surveying the land, because they did hope that one day settlers would move south and establish plantations and communities. Those plans mostly stayed on paper. The wilderness remained largely unchanged. But in recent years, archaeologists have uncovered small clues proving the British were not only coming, they were here. One of the things that I really love about our history in South Florida is that sometimes the biggest discoveries happen underneath the busiest streets. So think about it. You're driving down Brickell Avenue during rush hour. There's the big glass office towers and the restaurants and the luxury condos, all those people, thousands of people walking, milling about, doing their thing. Now imagine what's buried beneath all of that. Archaeologists discovered evidence of a British campsite dating back to the Revolutionary era. Among the artifacts were dark glass bottles commonly used during the 18th century and military-related items that connected the site to British occupation. Every day, people walk, drive, and work above land that once hosted British soldiers during the American Revolution. History, hiding right there in plain sight. So did anyone know about the independence? That's a question sometimes people ask. Well, sometimes I ask anyway. Most historians believe they did not. You see, Philadelphia is more than 1,000 miles away. Travel was slow. The population here, it was tiny. There weren't a whole lot of settlements. There simply was not an organized network to spread the news quickly. So even if someone heard about the Declaration of Independence, it likely would have taken weeks, months, and might have taken more than a year. And for many people living in British Florida, the conflict just may have seemed very distant. There might have been a war going on up north, but down here life continued much as it had before. Just fishing, farming, surviving the harsh environment. So while Americans today see July 4th as a defining national moment, it probably passed like any other day if you were in this area. Another interesting fact, Florida never joined the Revolution. Never. Many loyalists actually fled south into Florida to remain under British protection. So as war raged across the colonies, East Florida became something of a refuge for those who continued supporting the British Crown. That makes Florida's history very different from states like Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Because while those colonies were fighting for independence, Florida remained firmly under British control. And the people here, they were quite happy with that. But everything changed after the Revolutionary War ended. Britain recognized American independence, but it also negotiated with Spain. And as part of those agreements, England returned Florida to Spanish control in 1783. So, once again, Florida is a Spanish territory. If you're keeping score, Florida has now been ruled by Spain, then England, then Spain again. And it's still not part of the United States. It wasn't until 1821 that Spain officially transferred Florida to the United States. And suddenly, we were part of a young nation looking southward. American influence slowly began reaching the frontier, and one of the first priorities was improving navigation. The waters surrounding South Florida were dangerous. Coral reefs, those beautiful reefs that we love to see scuba diving or on glass-bottom boats or snorkeling, they claimed countless ships. To protect growing commerce, the government built lighthouses. Perhaps the most famous was the Cape Florida Lighthouse on Key Biscayne. It first started operating in the 1820s and became one of the earliest symbols of America's presence in Southeast Florida. Today, it's one of the oldest surviving structures in South Florida and still stands as a reminder of those early years. In 1822, beat the drums, blow the horns, Florida officially becomes a U.S. territory. And slowly, the arrival of settlers, it increased. Roads, such as they were, started to improve. Military outposts expanded. And in 1845, Florida officially entered the Union as the 27th state. And even then, South Florida was pretty isolated. Most settlements stayed in North and Central Florida, probably waiting for Disney World to be built. The southern peninsula, that felt like another world still. Now, early American settlers did try establishing plantations along the Miami River. Some succeeded for a while, many struggled, because the climate was difficult, as we said, transportation limited, and there was a little thing called the Seminole Wars, which added additional challenges. Pieces of that history can still be found today. Near downtown Miami, historic sites preserve remnants from those early settlements, including former plantation buildings that later served military purposes during the Seminole Wars. These surviving landmarks remind us that Miami's beginnings were far humbler than its modern skyline suggests. And I'll put some links in the show notes. You can go back, and we've covered some of this before. The lighthouse on Key Biscayne, the Seminole Wars, even the Cooley Massacre in Fort Lauderdale. I'll put the links in there. But as time passed, eventually, first some small farming communities began taking root. Vegetables, citrus became big, tropical fruits. Communities like Coconut Grove emerged. Lemon City followed. And slowly, but very slowly, the population increased. Decades later, visionaries like Julia Tuttle would recognize Miami's incredible potential. Henry Flagler's railroad would arrive. The city would officially incorporate in 1896. And everything that makes modern South Florida possible started with those early people who transformed wilderness into communities. We'll talk a little bit more about this growing South Florida area in just a moment. We'll be right back. Hi, this is Bill Monty, and if you enjoy the podcast, sharing episodes, spreading the word, well, truly that means a lot, and it helps the show grow like you wouldn't believe. But if you'd like to support the podcast a little further, I ask you to please click the Buy Me a Coffee link that you can find in the show notes. Your support helps offset production and hosting costs so I can keep bringing you more stories, memories, and conversations in each episode. And besides, podcasting is a thirsty business, so I appreciate you filling my cup with some Joe. Hey, thanks for listening. Thank you for being part of the journey. And if you can, thank you for buying me a cup of coffee. Now, I think one of the most fascinating lessons from this story got to be the perspective that you can put into all of this. When we celebrate July 4th, Independence Day, it's easy to imagine every corner of America sharing that historic moment. But as I said, America looked very different back in 1776, and South Florida was not a vibrant destination because it wasn't filled with beaches and resorts. It was one of the most remote frontiers in North America. The Declaration of Independence, it changed history and South Florida forever. But that transformation, it took decades. Sometimes history, it doesn't happen all at once. It arrives slowly. One lighthouse, one farm, one settlement, one family, and eventually one city. And all of that becomes one story that's just another of the many tales from South Florida. If you enjoyed today's journey into our region's forgotten past, I'd love it if you would follow the podcast by subscribing or hitting that follow button. Leave a review, share some comments, and share the episode with someone else who enjoys South Florida history. I also invite you to please visit talesfromsouthflorida.com for more episodes, photos, and stories celebrating the people, places, and events that shaped our unique corner of the Sunshine State. And if you find value in Tales from South Florida as entertainment or historical lessons, I invite you also to please visit the Buy Me a Coffee link, and I say thank you in advance. Until next time, my friends, I'm Bill Monty. Be safe and be kind.
Let's take a talk down memory lane, 'cause the stories around here are just insane. Pirates World, to Sporto and Wolfie's Zoo, Palm Beach to Key West, that's where we grew. These are the tales from South Florida for you, with your host Bill Monty.
Hello, friends. Bill Monty here, and I'm inviting you to join me on the podcast Bill Monty's Guide for Getting Older. Now, this is not a podcast about being old. No, it's about understanding the world we're growing older in, how we care for each other, how we protect what we've built, and how we make sense of the systems that are supposed to look out for us, especially when we need them the most. Bill Monty's Guide for Getting Older. It is available wherever fine podcasts can be found, and I look forward to talking with you soon.